Whenever there is transformation, there must be Shakti behind it. So in the story of Jesus, there comes this figure. And her place is very prominent. The place of Mary Magdalene is very prominent. However, we are not entirely sure what to make out of it. Certainly, there is this feeling that the significance of the presence of Mary Magdalene somehow was undermined by the narrative of the story itself, or by the interpretations, again, the official interpretations of the story itself. We know very well that there are some very distinctive encounters. The one when Jesus first meets Mary Magdalene, when she was about to be stoned by a group of people, and he rescues her with his famous line, "Throw a stone," right? Let the one cast the first stone who is without a sin. And that, where's that stone? Yeah, so, it's a piece of rock, right? But anyone who is without a sin, right? Cast a stone. Variously interpreted, of course, that encounter was. The official line, the official interpretation is that Jesus must be hinting at the original sin. And that's how the custodians preferred to interpret that. That he must be speaking of the original sin, the fall of Adam, that all of us carry. Therefore, kind of neatly connecting the dots, connecting all the story with the original sin and the original fall reconciled by Jesus. And we also know that from there on, Mary Magdalene becomes a devotee of Christ. Simply one of his most committed devotees. And there is a second very important encounter. She reappears in the story, but her place is not defined in the official line. She's just there, often, very, very often to, if you will, contrast the sanctity of Christ, often to just appear on a background and to show Christ's humility, to contrast, to bring it out. Then there is another very important encounter when Christ, after the resurrection, she is the first to whom Christ appears. She is the first among all the disciples to whom Christ appears immediately upon the resurrection. And that famous encounter, "Noli mi tangere," touch me not, do not touch me. Again, one of the most favorite subject in the history of art. There are many, many versions of that encounter, where she is moved to worship the feet of her beloved teacher, beloved master, beloved guide. She is moved to touch his feet and actually wash his feet with her hair, clean his feet with her hair as she has done before. And yet Christ restrains her He restrains her with a gesture, as the story goes, and that famous line in Latin. I don't know how it sounds in other languages, but that's how it is known in the history of art. I mean, you go to the museum, noli me tangere. Whether this is a Renaissance piece of art or some kind of abstract from the postmodernism, you know what we're talking about. It's that encounter. Before we go into the possible interpretations of that encounter, and some of you may have read the essay I've written some times ago, entitled just that, Noli me tangere, I would like to suggest and identify who was Mary Magdalene in the story. Who is Mary Magdalene here? And if we are to follow the Tantric Christ as an overall theme, then Mary Magdalene is none other than Kundalini herself. She is the Shakti. And there are some interpretations, some suggestions that it is the Jesus himself who exemplifies Kundalini. And some of you might have even assumed that in the course of these days. Because when we spoke of awakening of our consciousness, very often we have spoken about this inner anatomy, yogic perspectives, right? And we have mentioned Kundalini before, haven't we? However, this is a very subtle distinction, which I invite you to delve deeply, because it opens up greater understanding of the process itself, the process of awakening, and what is actually happening in that process. Because it would not be correct to say that it is Jesus who exemplifies Kundalini. Jesus stands here for that, Christ consciousness. This is consciousness itself, Chit. The principle of Chit. This is consciousness itself. Consciousness cannot be born or die, obviously. Come and go. Hence, here we will enter another dimension or another dimensionality of Christian mysteries, which will open up and confirm our possible interpretations suggested earlier, that Christianity did not start with the birth of Jesus at an accepted moment in time in history. But rather, this is a reoccurrence of events according to its necessity. And if we are to speak from Tantric perspective, although Kundalini as Shakti, as energy, is equal with consciousness, it is consciousness, yet it's also simultaneously a very, very different state of consciousness. And I'm just here proposing that in the story, Mary Magdalene came out of essentially that what could be named as the lowest place in life. She was, like a woman who was lost to her social, place in a social strata. She's like a casteless woman. She's a prostitute, and Christ finds her in precisely that moment when she's essentially fallen and to be stoned. Analogy here is simply a picturesque representation of consciousness that collapses into itself. It's the state of Kundalini. It's the state of Kundalini, which resides at the lowest chakra, which resides at the base chakra. And although, how do we make that connection? Isn't Christ awakened? Not awakened, isn't Jesus was born before and there were these years? This is where the linearity of the story is not helpful. This is where no myth and no story will make sense if we only stick to the linearity of the story. And Mary Magdalene and the role of Mary Magdalene was undermined precisely because of her significance in the official story. And the significance of Mary Magdalene is tremendous, because it is literally that what empowers this whole process. How it comes that she is not figuring more actively in the story, it's another story altogether. But it is something for you to consider, that if there is transformation, if the story of Jesus, it's the story of transformation of consciousness, there must be Shakti element there. There must be feminine element, the element of energy itself. So who would represent that element? And we can look, not many figures can actually what would be the right example? Not fall into that category, but fill that role. Thank you. But Mary Magdalene precisely does that. And that encounter, the first initial encounter, is literally where Mary Magdalene is being redeemed in one immediate gesture, in one immediate encounter with Jesus. It's that encounter of the collapsed consciousness with pure consciousness itself, where she rises. She simply rises to her own status. She recognizes, and from there on, as we know, she is devotedly in love with Jesus. This we know in the story. The story allows that. The story allows that emotional intensity. As we know, Mary Magdalene is in love with Jesus. Remember these tender dialogues that take place between them. She calls him Rabbi, remember? Which is tender for teacher. And that is precisely the relationship of energy with its source. Because that's what Jesus exemplifies, even though there's still process going on, unfolding. The reason why I wanted to bring this up is to so that we tap into this inner alchemy of the process. The inner alchemy of the process, and also that will explain and take us out of the loop. Why, if we are already consciousness and awareness and nothing else, why are we not aware of that at all times? These are the mechanics, I would say the neurophysiological reasons behind the process of slumber and enlightenment and everything in between. This is literally rooted in the biology of consciousness. Do not be afraid of that term, the biology of consciousness. Consciousness is subjected subjected to this physiological container where it takes place and nowhere else. If immediate footnote, one of the other reasons why devatas and angels in heaven, according to ancient Indian lore, and not just ancient Indian, secretly envious towards humans, towards human beings. It's not just because the human beings are equipped with organs of cognition when they can literally partake in this wonder of this world fully, but because it is nowhere but in the human physiology that the realization is possible. It is not possible in the astral body of a devata, divinity or angel. There's no physiology. So you are an angel for however many ions until you exhaust that karma and come back as a human. Now I can do the work. There's another perspective. A precious perspective. And you will find leitmotifs of many, many spiritual traditions is to point to the preciousness of human birth. Preciousness of human birth. So the dynamics between consciousness and consciousness as Kundalini or consciousness as Shakti is that dynamics. Kundalini is that what essentially allows consciousness to uncoil from its self-imposed state. It allows consciousness to unfold, spread its wings again. So what happens to that process? What happens to that process? Where it culminates? Where is it being taken? And that other, again, iconographical encounter, the no limit tanjuri, do not touch me, also reveals some very subtle inner dynamics. You see, if prior to that, Mary Magdalene was always accompanied Jesus everywhere. She followed him. She was there at all times. After the resurrection, when Jesus reappears in front of Mary Magdalene, and she is prompted in that encounter to connect to him through the sense of touch, to connect and to feel that physical connection with the Master, with her beloved. He tells her and he restrains her, do not touch me. What does it mean? What does it represent? What is being here at play?